Hey folks, Mike here, and this is going to be the second in my series of videos covering meta-ethics for the AQA A Level in Philosophy. Here we're going to look at ethical naturalism in a little bit more detail. Apologies, by the way, just in advance if you occasionally hear banging or random noises throughout this video. I'm having my garden done at the moment, so you might occasionally hear tractors and things like that moving earth as I've got the windows open because it's about 900 degrees in here. Before we get started, if you've not watched my previous videos covering some of the key terms from the meta-ethics topic, then you may want to go back and check that out, as we will be using those terms throughout this video. They're things like realism and anti-realism, cognitivism and non-cognitivism. But just as a quick reminder, realism and anti-realism are about whether or not the object or statement that we are referring to exists as part of reality, mind independently, in which case we would be realist about the thing in question, or whether or not it exists mind dependently, whether or not it's a creation of ourselves, in which case we are anti-realist about the thing in question. Cognitivism and non-cognitivism, meanwhile, are about whether or not the statement in question can be considered to be true or false. If you think it can be considered to be true or false, then you are a cognitivist about that particular thing or about that particular language. If you think it can't be considered to be true or false, then you are a non-cognitivist about that particular statement or language. Okay, so to give a little bit of context before we look at naturalism, then we may want to ask where we get our idea of morality from. Now, this is something that we have been hinting at all the way through our discussion of meta-ethics, and it's not exactly a discussion of perhaps who taught us right and wrong, but where our concept of morality itself actually comes from, an ultimate origin, so to speak. So I'm not asking, was it your parents that taught you morality or your school that taught you morality? I'm wondering, where do those moral ideas come from to start with? Now, there's a number of possible answers to this question, and a few of those options I'm going to put on screen here, but it's worth pointing out very, very quickly that this list isn't exhaustive. There's huge amounts of discussion about this very question, and there are different answers and different opinions and different ideas that people are coming up with every year in philosophy. Here are just some of the ones that we're going to be discussing in meta-ethics. So if we take a realist approach to this question of where morality actually comes from, then one possible option is to say that morality is a natural fact about the world. It is something we can discover through experience, much in the same way that we might scientifically examine the world to find physical or chemical facts. A second possible option from the realist approach is to say that morality is a non-natural fact about the world. It's something that we can't use experience or science to discover. In fact, we need to take a different approach to figure out what morality is. The usual approach of the non-naturalists is to say that it requires reason or intuition to figure out morality. On the other hand, we may look at a couple of anti-realist views that argue that morality is somehow the creation of humanity, or at very least creation of a mind. One possible option is to say that it's simply our emotional responses to a particular event. A second possible option under the anti-realist view is to say that it comes from society or culture in some way, that morality is somehow helping us further ourselves as a species, and therefore it serves a role and is created, maintained and adjusted as such. It is, of course, these first two, the realist approaches, that we're going to be looking at in a little bit more detail in this video and the next one. But what do we actually mean when we say that morality is a fact about the world, whether that fact is natural or non-natural? What moral realism is actually claiming is that moral facts, like a particular thing being good or bad, are actual properties of situation, people and actions, in much the same way that cold and hot, or red and blue, or rough and smooth are properties of a particular object. Moral properties are genuine parts of the world, according to moral realism. Whether moral judgments are therefore true or false depends on how the world actually is, and whether the action, person or situation actually has those properties. Now, why might we assume that there are in fact moral truths or moral facts in the world for us to discover? Well, there's a number of reasons for this. The first is that we think we can and do in fact make mistakes about morality. Children, for example, have to be taught what is right or wrong from a very young age, otherwise they just do whatever they want or feel like at any given point in time. If there were no facts about moral right or wrong, it wouldn't be possible for us to make mistakes. It would just be differences of opinion or differences of ideas. Essentially, because we think that some morality can be correct and some morality can be incorrect, that would suggest that there has to be some moral facts out there for our ideas or our understanding to match up with. If there isn't, how could we ever be mistaken about morality? A second argument is that morality feels like a demand or a command from outside of us. It's not like something like our music taste or our food taste that feels very much like an opinion, an internal thing. Instead, morality feels like something external. Feels like something that is independent of what we want or feel in any circumstance, and it isn't determined by what we think about it. In short, it feels like a part of reality, a part of the world around us, rather than a creation of our minds or our feelings. A third argument for moral realism is the fact that many people believe in moral progress, that we are somehow improving our understanding of morality. So if, for example, we look back at our idea of right and wrong across the last 100 years, we would say that surely we are in a better position now. We have a better understanding of good and bad and right or wrong now than we did 20, 30, 40 or 50 years ago. But if morality is just opinion based, then we can't really say that. All we can say is that people 50 years ago had a different view of morality than we do now. They weren't wrong, our opinions just differ. And that doesn't sit right with a lot of people. We want to be able to say that, for example, views on homosexuality in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were definitely morally wrong. They were definitely mistaken. But for us to do that, there has to be some facts that our morality lines up with. There has to be some facts that our understanding of right or wrong matches with or doesn't match with. Essentially, for moral progress to be a real thing, we have to say that moral realism is correct. We have to say that there are moral truths out there in reality, out there in the world that we can access, and we are getting better at accessing over time. Now, in the last 150 years or so, moral realism has been focused on trying to decipher the relationship between moral properties, i.e. things like right and wrong, and natural properties. Now, natural properties in philosophy have a very specific definition. They effectively are things that we can examine empirically. We can check through sense experience or scientifically, for example. So essentially, moral realists have been asking, are moral properties natural, i.e. are they things that we can examine through science, or are they some other type of weird property, something that we can't examine through science but is still a real fact about the world? And that in turn has led us to two separate views under the umbrella of moral realism. One is ethical naturalism that we're going to be looking at in a little bit of detail today. Naturalists claim that moral properties are just natural properties, that we can examine moral properties through science in the same way we might examine colour or temperature or taste. On the other hand, we have ethical or moral non-naturalists. They want to claim that moral properties are a distinct type of property. They are not natural. We can't examine them through experience. Instead, we have to approach them in a different way. Whilst they are part of the world, we are going to have to figure out another way of understanding morality rather than just examining it through experience. Now, as I say, it is naturalism that we're going to be looking at in a little bit of detail for the rest of this video. But before we do so, I just want to mention one more key term that you guys need to know, and that is the idea of reduction. Naturalism primarily is a reductive concept. And what this means when we talk about reductionism is that things in one domain or of one type are identical to things in another domain or of another type. So for naturalists, moral properties of goodness and rightness or badness and wrongness are identical with certain natural properties. They are the same as these natural properties. So if you have these natural properties, then you have goodness and badness or rightness and wrongness. And what type of natural properties are we talking about? Well, the most plausible view of naturalism is that these natural properties are psychological in some form, that moral properties, moral ideas like rightness and wrongness relate to particular psychological properties that an action either produces or a person has or doesn't have. Is this starting to sound familiar? Well, it should do, because there is one theory that we've already discussed this year that is naturalist at its very core, that says that rightness and wrongness are related to a particular psychological property that somebody has or doesn't have. I am, of course, talking about utilitarianism, because utilitarians claim that moral judgments are simply judgments about how much happiness an action will produce. That an action is right if it produces a certain amount of this natural property of happiness, and an action is wrong if it doesn't produce that natural property of happiness, or if it produces instead another natural property like pain or displeasure. Happiness is a natural fact about the world, therefore, according to utilitarianism, moral judgments are based on natural facts about the world, hence naturalism. What reasoning do we have for believing that naturalism is true? That when we talk about morality, we are in fact just talking about natural properties like happiness or pleasure? Well, apart from the fact that Bentham himself seems to make this definition clear in his view of utilitarianism, where he says that morality is simply whether or not an action produces pleasure or pain, Mill also has given an argument for utilitarianism that we've seen previously that seems to connect natural properties to moral properties as well. He seems to draw a link between the moral concept or property of goodness and the natural facts of happiness and desirability. Now, I've paraphrased his argument here. We did go through it in a little bit more detail back in the utilitarianism topic. If you are not one of my students watching this, then I'm afraid you'll just have to go and have a look online for the Mill argument for the moment until I can get around to recording a video on that in future. But I will say it won't be for a while yet, so you may want to do a little bit of research first. So Mill intends to prove utilitarianism with this argument, but for our purposes, it's effectively him trying to show that goodness and happiness are one and the same thing. And it goes a little bit like this. He says that if something is desirable, then achieving it is good to the person who desires it. And that seems kind of obvious. If we want something, if we desire something, then we would call it good if we get or achieve that particular thing. He then says that everybody desires their own happiness. Therefore, people's happiness is said to be desirable because we desire it. And by extension, if we achieve happiness or if we get happiness for some reason, then we would call it good. We would call it good for ourselves or good to the individuals who happen to desire happiness and then achieve it. Because each of us desires our own happiness, it makes sense that we would as a species desire happiness for everybody. Therefore, we can say that the good for the human race as a whole, for everybody as a whole, is simply happiness for everyone. So we can see here in the conclusion that Mill definitely seems to be making a case for a naturalistic view of morality. He seems to want to say that goodness is simply how much happiness an action produces. Or goodness is simply people achieving happiness. Either way, happiness is a natural property, therefore morality is a natural property. Now, there are some issues with this argument we've seen previously, including the case that he seems to equivocate something being desired and desirability. That always doesn't seem to be true when we use the terms normally, and the fallacy of composition is potentially also an issue here. But we're not going to discuss those in detail, as I want to try and focus this video on naturalism, and getting bogged down in Mill's argument isn't going to help us achieve that. So once again, if you want to know a little bit more about those, you'll have to go and have a look back through your notes when we did this argument back in the utilitarianism topic, or you'll have to go and have a look online to see what you can find out about some of the issues with this argument. Now, utilitarianism isn't the only naturalistic view of ethics. Virtue ethics, one of the other three theories that we've discussed this year, can also be said to be naturalistic in some way as well, but it's not quite the same as utilitarianism. Aristotle seems to focus on eudaimonia as a natural goal for humans, and the idea that rationality, our characteristic activity, our purpose, is a natural activity that humans can do or humans can act upon and no other species can. But it's worth stressing here that whilst we could argue virtue ethics is a naturalistic theory, it's not like utilitarianism. Utilitarianism seems to claim that we can judge morality. We can say that moral properties are simply a single type of natural property, whether or not an action produces pleasure or happiness or not. But instead, in virtue ethics, what we are talking about here is that rightness or wrongness is in fact a multitude of natural properties working together. It isn't just one thing. To be good, according to a virtue ethicist, isn't to just have a single natural property. It is actually to have a lot of different natural properties working in harmony. In other words, goodness isn't the same as just rationality or just having the virtues or just achieving eudaimonia for virtue ethics. It's in fact a sum of all these constituent parts. Morality is all of these natural properties working together. So although the theory is still naturalistic, it's not quite the same as utilitarianism. Now, there are some general strengths of a naturalistic view of morality. The first is that there is no puzzle about what kind of thing goodness is. If we can link goodness to specific natural properties about the world, then we don't have to wonder constantly what type of thing goodness is, whether it's something that is opinion-based or feeling-based, or whether it is a fact about the world that we access in some weird way. If it's natural, we can simply examine it in the same way that we examine science or other facts about the world. And that leads us on to the second strength of naturalism, which is the fact that if naturalism is true, we can discover what goodness is simply through experiencing the world and through scientific investigation. We can actually figure out the correct view of morality by just examining the world around us. Finally, it also means that we can effectively measure right and wrong through experience. We can do tests to figure out whether a particular action is right or wrong. There should be no worries in future about morality if naturalism is correct and if we can convince people that naturalism is correct. Unfortunately, there are some issues with naturalism as well, and some general issues with realism. The issues with naturalism we're going to consider in the next video as a starting point for our discussion of non-naturalism. We're going to look at a specific criticism of naturalism called the naturalistic fallacy that argues that there is no connection between natural properties of the world and moral properties of the world, because moral properties are their own undefinable thing. They are their own distinct property of the world. They are not simply a natural property. And this comes from a guy called G.E. Moore, that dude on your screen there. So what have we covered in this video? Well, we've been looking at naturalism. Naturalism claims that moral properties like good and bad and right and wrong are actually just natural properties, things that exist in the world and can be investigated empirically, which makes it a realist theory. For example, we might say that a non-ethical statement such as the dog in the garden can be verified by evidence. We can go and check whether there is a dog in the garden. And similarly, an ethical statement such as murder is wrong can also be verified by evidence. Somebody's dead, that happens to make people unhappy or afraid, and therefore it is wrong because it produces that unhappiness or fear. If naturalism is correct, morals are not about your point of view or my opinion, but they are in fact objectively true. There are moral facts about reality that we can access and we can also be wrong about. It's also a cognitivist view because we can express these moral properties, these moral statements, in a way that is true or false. True if they match up with the truth about reality. It is false if they don't match up with the truth about reality. We've said that some views of moral naturalism are reductive. They state that we can define morality or reduce it in some way to a natural property, that in fact morality is just natural properties. And the most well-established version of reductive naturalism is utilitarianism, because utilitarians simply argue that goodness can be reduced to or is just the same as the natural property of happiness or pleasure. That's supported in Bentham's writing and in Mill's proof of utilitarianism, but there are potentially some issues with both of those. We've also said that virtue ethics is a version of naturalism, stating that goodness is made up of natural properties like virtues, habituation, eudaimonia, rationality. But unlike utilitarianism, it is not a single one of these properties that is goodness, but it is in fact all of them working in union. So that's it. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you have a decent idea of what naturalism is now. Thanks for listening, and if you found this useful, please do all of that good stuff like liking, sharing, subscribing to this channel. Please comment below if you've got any questions. I know I've had a couple from previous weeks. I'm going to go through and answer those soon. And please follow the channel for more videos like this in future. Hopefully they're going to come a little bit quicker now. But all in all, have a good one, people. Enjoy the weather. Enjoy apparently the start of summer. Have a good one. Bye.